Hi, Joey. Okay.
Hello, welcome to the OSU Alumni Association's Travel Talk presentation, Greece and a Journey Through the Mediterranean, with OSU Emeritus Professor of History, Dr. Gary B. Ferngren. I'm Kate Sanders, Director for Alumni Programs and Alumni Group Travel. The OSU Alumni Association online Travel Talk series is our way of connecting the people of OSU, whether alumni, professors, or students, and the places we go. Some of you are viewing today have traveled with us in the past, and some are new to the program. Welcome. Our travel program has been around for over 30 years, providing group tour options for our alumni and friends of the university. We offer both exclusive departures and trips with a mix of OSU alumni and other partnering schools. Every year, we select between 30 to 40 tours from a variety of well-established and well-respected travel providers. When a tour sells well, a professor, a university leader, or an alumni association representative joins the tour, providing additional educational content about the destination and the university. Not only is the bond with the university strengthened by sending an OSU ambassador, but they also assist with tour logistics and help ensure you have a great time. So save the date for some more upcoming travel talks in the near future. On February 21st, we are going to talk about Croatia and the Dalmatian coast, and specifically the region's connection to the popular HBO series Games of Thrones. Then in March, Dr. Elizabeth Tomasino will join us for a talk on Italian wines and coffee. She joined us last spring for an online presentation, and it was a wine tasting, and it was a lot of fun. So you'll want to save the date for that one. We have a few more in tune for April and May. In May, I'm trying to put together a D-Day presentation, so hopefully that one will be scheduled here shortly. But then on June 6th, Dr. Sunil Khanna, professor and Robert and Sarah Rothschild Endowed Chair at the College of Public Health and Human Sciences, will talk about Africa and specifically his work in Botswana. If you would like to review any of these webcasts or any of our earlier talks, please visit ForOregonState.org/travel talks. The recordings are linked at the very bottom of the page. This program is being recorded, and we will post it online in the next few days. You will also receive an email with a link to the recordings as well. At the end of tonight's presentation, stay tuned for some very brief information on 4 tours in 2023 that will be traveling to Greece and the Mediterranean. So about tonight's presentation. Tonight, we are talking, as I said, with Emeritus Professor of History, Dr. Gary Ferngren, and explore Greece and Turkey's historical and cultural highlights. Dr. Ferngren has taught Greek and Roman history at Oregon State since 1970 and teaches regularly in the university's Honors College. He has received several awards for teaching, including the university's highest teaching prize, the Elizabeth Ritchie Award for Outstanding Teaching, and was named a university's Honors College Eminent Professor in 2011. Gary is a veteran traveler and has lectured at sea many times. He began teaching and lecturing for Semester at Sea in 1975 on an epic Mediterranean and Caribbean cruise, and has continued to lecture on close to 40 cruises all over the world. So now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ferngren. There you are. Hi, welcome.
Hi, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction.
You're welcome.
I believe that travel can and should be an educational experience. It involves not only seeing important historical sites, but some of the world's greatest art and architecture. And it provides a historical background that adds to our enjoyment of the world that we live in today. This map traces the route that I propose to follow, highlighting the Greek world of antiquity. We begin on the mainland of Greece and sail to several of the prominent islands in the Aegean and visit well-known coastal cities of what is today the coast of Turkey. Because the poor soil and limited natural resources of the Greek mainland were factors that the Greeks had to live with, the ancient Greeks began to colonize the coastal regions of the Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium BC. They traveled as far as the Iberian Peninsula in the west, as far as the Ukraine in the Black Sea area, and altogether founded several hundred colonies around the Mediterranean. For centuries, Greece was dependent on merchant ships that imported food from her colonies, including grain from the Ukraine, as well as from Egypt. Merchant ships and warships, like the biremes shown here, carried the Greeks to their colonies and provided their navies with fleets to engage in warfare with their enemies. The largest of the Greek states was Athens, which grew rapidly from a small town to a population of about 350,000 at its peak. The Acropolis was initially Athens' protection in case of an attack, but in the mid-5th century BC, it became the site of some of the most beautiful temples in Greece. The most impressive was the Parthenon, or the Temple of Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin, the patron goddess of the city. It was preserved throughout antiquity, but nearly destroyed in an explosion on September 26th of 1687. The Acropolis was under siege, and the Parthenon had been used by the Ottoman Turks as a powder magazine, that is, to store gunpowder. A direct hit one evening at 7 o'clock badly damaged it. Restoration over the past century has restored much of its majesty and commanding architectural beauty. I've seen several changes that have enhanced the building since I first visited it in the late 60s. The Erechtheion is the second temple on the Acropolis. Its graceful Ionic columns give it an elegance that contrasts with the heavier Doric columns of the Parthenon. The Erechtheion honors Athens' mythical followers, including Poseidon and Athens' first king. The porch of the Caryatids, shown here, displays 6 chorai, or maidens, each carrying a basket on her head. One of the original statues can be seen today in the British Museum, together with the Elgin marbles, which include the beautiful friezes of the Parthenon, which were nearly destroyed and lay on the ground for many years until rescued by Lord Elgin. They were taken to England at his expense in 1816, retrieved from ruins near the temples, and in order to protect them from weathering, all the Caryatids have been replaced by replicas in the Erechtheion, with the remaining originals on display in the fairly new Acropolis Museum. Beautification of the Acropolis was undertaken in the 5th century under Pericles, who introduced the reforms that made Athens the greatest democracy in the Greek world, and I would argue perhaps the best in the world, ancient and modern, in carrying out the will of its citizens. The Piraeus was the harbor of Athens. In the 5th century BC, Athens developed the most powerful navy in the Aegean. Within a half century, it controlled a far-flung group of cities in an empire that all paid tribute to Athens and made it a very wealthy city. To protect Athens from a land attack by her traditional enemy of Sparta, which unlike Athens was a land empire, Pericles had the Athenians construct the long walls to collect the Piraeus with the city of Athens in 458 BC. Since grain and other necessities came to Athens by ship, the food supply of the city could not be cut off in war once the walls were in place, as they were by the middle of the 5th century. The Piraeus had 3 harbors, one of which protected the navy when it was in port. Across the Saronic Gulf from Athens lay the city of Corinth, which controlled the isthmus, a 4-mile wide neck of land that connected central Greece, where Athens is situated, with the isthmus on which Corinth was situated. Corinth's access to both Eastern and Western trade made it the wealthiest city in Greece. The narrowness of the isthmus made it possible to pull ships over a portage road that was built called the Diolkos, which is shown here, still in existence after 2,000 or more years. Efforts to dig a canal across the isthmus proved impossible with the limited technology of the ancient Greek world. And for centuries, ships were pulled across the isthmus. This video demonstrates how Greek ships were pulled across the isthmus in the ancient world. They were pulled for 4 miles across the Diolkos, and they were carried, or I should say pulled, entirely by human labor in ancient times. Several Greeks who ruled the city advanced the idea of creating a canal, but they simply didn't have the technology or the labor to do it. There were many attempts. In his efforts to build a canal, the Roman Emperor Nero employed 6,000 Judean captives that had been taken by the Romans during the Judean revolt, and he turned the first spade himself. But Nero died before any work could be undertaken. In 1881, work was built on digging a modern canal. The effort took 10 years, and it was finished in 1892 by a French company that had earlier built the Suez Canal. It was first used in 1893. It has no locks and can be used only for small ships. But one can take a cruise ship to the canal today, as I did a few years ago. We had traveled down the coast of Croatia and came inside the Corinthian Gulf and around to the eastern entrance. And here we're shown going through. You can see the 2 bridges have been there for many years, but it's quite an impressive ship. I stood on the bow of the ship for, I guess it must have been nearly an hour, and was quite impressed on the way in which it had been carved out of the earth. The city of Mycenae is shown here in the next slide, I think. It was the largest of the fortified cities by the earliest Greeks who migrated into the Greek mainland about 1900 BC. The Mycenaeans settled in the Peloponnese in southern Greece, and they were the first Greek-speaking people to enter Greece, and they formed a confederation of cities that Homer in the Iliad says attacked Troy. The most famous of the archaeological remains of Mycenae is the famous Lion's Gate. It was the entrance to the walled city. It was unearthed in 1841. Until much later in the century, it was the only aspect of Mycenae that had been excavated. But Heinrich Schliemann, the German amateur archaeologist, believed that Homer had written history and not myth, and he accepted the Iliad and the Odyssey as having described actual events. This led to his discovery and the excavation of the legendary city of Troy in northern Turkey, after which Schliemann traveled to the Greek mainland to try to find Mycenae. In 1874, he started to dig shafts without permission all over the site. Schliemann didn't wait for permission from anybody. He dove in, and over the side of the citadel, he began work, and in 2 years after that, 1876, he finally received approval for a complete excavation. He found ancient graves in the city with royal skeletons and spectacular grave goods, many of them precious metals, at the location which was marked on the earlier map. And it included, among other things, the mask of Agamemnon. He was a pretty rough person at excavating. Some people called him a butcher, but more scientific excavations have taken place at Mycenae, mainly by Greek archaeologists, but also by archaeologists working through the British School at Athens. Several royal burial sites were found on the plateau of the fortified city, and they produced a treasure of golden objects. Schliemann is supposed to have said, "I have gazed at the fate of Agamemnon himself," when a death mask was discovered, although modern research suggests that it predates the Trojan War by 300 to 400 years. So it wasn't Agamemnon, but that was what Schliemann was looking for. And he discovered, among other things, this royal gold cup. All of these were from the royal household, and a diadem that graced the head of a member of the royal family. These stunning gold objects can be seen today in a spectacular room in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, which I think no visitor should ever miss seeing. The best room, perhaps, in the whole museum. Outside the fortified palace, Schliemann discovered several of what he called beehive tombs. The most famous he called, naturally, the tomb of Agamemnon, which he assumed was the burial place of the legendary king of Mycenae, who was featured in Homer's Iliad as the leader of the confederation of Greek cities who sailed to Troy. This image shows an imaginative reconstruction of the interior of Agamemnon's tomb. After cruise ships depart from Athens, they often call first at the island of Mykonos, the so-called Island of the Winds. Mykonos attracts many holiday seekers who come to the beautiful site, and it is a beautiful island, not to visit ruins so much as to enjoy lying on the beach in the hot Greek sun. I can remember talking to a young English woman when we were traveling across to the island itself, and she was going to Mykonos for 2 weeks. And I asked, "What are you going to do?" And she said, "Lie on the beach in the sun." And it's a very popular island with holiday makers. Mykonos is known for its scenic windmills. They were built in the recent past centuries to grind grain into flour. Today, they have no functional use, but they grace the island and they greet its visitors. Mykonos contains many picturesque churches and chapels, hundreds of them, if you believe the guidebooks, supposedly one for every day of the year. They were built as offerings by the island's fishermen for protection and thanks to God for their safe return with a large catch. And it is a very beautiful town for walking around. You can't enter many of the chapels, but you can see some. In the shadow of Mykonos is the tiny island of Delos. It is said to have been the birthplace of the gods Apollo and Artemis. It became the treasury of the Delian League that was organized by Athens for protection against a Persian invasion of Greece. Delos later became a duty-free port, and most of the few things that you see on the island were built during that later time. The emaciated lions of Delos are the best known of the few ancient sculptures on the tiny island. Santorini is the most strikingly beautiful island in the Aegean. I don't think any cruise to the Aegean should miss this delightful volcanic island. This is an artist's rendition of the island. Thera, it was called, before it was called Santorini. And the crater dates from probably the great explosion of about 1500 BC, which left the caldera, you can see on the right side of the illustration, the caldera in the center surrounded by fragments of the island. Santorini is still an active volcano, but it last erupted in 1950 and it poses no danger to visitors today. The red dot on the map indicates the site of the important city called Akrotiri, which was discovered in quite modern times. This is Akrotiri. It was discovered and excavated by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatus. Marinatus organized extensive facilities. He spent much of his life on the island every year researching and preserving the island's artifacts and the building. You can take from Akrotiri a trip out to see the ancient ruins. His excavations, interestingly enough, produced no human remains, which indicates that the inhabitants had evacuated the city before it was buried by the eruption. Marinatus died in 1974 at the site of the excavation, either by a stroke or by a wall collapsing on him. We don't know which. Among the most beautiful discoveries at Akrotiri were the painted frescoes on the plastered walls of the interior of homes. Shown here are two of the most famous, the earliest depiction of boxers in Europe on the left, and an island boy proudly displaying his catch of fish. Here's one of the picturesque villages overlooking the caldera. It's an unforgettable sight for any tourist visiting the island. I enjoyed sitting with my wife on occasions we went there, just having a glass of cool wine and surveying not only the caldera, but the many ships that come to the island each day, which you can see. And by the way, you can walk up or down if you want, or you can take a donkey. The problem with walking down is that donkeys produce their litter along the way, but you can also take a funicular, and that's probably the best way to go. The island of Crete is the southernmost of the Cyclades Islands in the Aegean. It was the site of a pre-Greek settlement by people that came to be known as the Minoans, who probably colonized the islands in the Aegean before 2500 BC. They were named after the legendary King Minos, who was said in the tradition of Greece to have built a naval empire from his royal capital of Knossos, which is situated just a few miles outside the capital city of Heraklion. While most Greek historians had regarded the Minoans as mythical, a young English adventurer by the name of Arthur Evans came to Crete while he was pursuing examples of early writing, for which he had a fascination. He visited the site that Schliemann had earlier identified as the possible location of Knossos, and he stayed there, and over the next 5 years, he purchased all the land around it. In 1900, Evans began to excavate, and by the end of the first day, he had discovered the first archaeological remains of what he identified as the Palace of Knossos. You can see him here in his pith helmet. Excavators who went to Egypt or Greece always had plenty of locals that they could hire to do the hard work. He went on to dig for several years. By 1903, most of the palace had been unearthed. And this is a model of what they found. It had more than 1,000 rooms and a highly sophisticated system of bringing fresh water into the palace and of draining off wastewater into a nearby city. It may have included the first flushing toilet in history. Certainly some very beautiful bathtubs. This is a sunken storage area that contained large jars of grain, wine, and other foodstuffs. The plaster walls of the palace were covered with beautiful frescoes. They've all been restored today. Some were rather imaginatively restored by the father and son team of Swiss artists that Evans invited to come. A common theme was that of a charging bull. And while Evans based recreations on archaeological evidence, he was very careful about that. Some of the best known frescoes from the throne room were nearly complete inventions of the Swiss father and son. The most famous fresco, and you've probably seen it reproduced in a number of books on the Greek world, is one of a bronze-skinned young man doing a forward somersault over a charging bull. If you read older books, you will read almost universally that authors said this must be imaginative because it was an impossible act to perform. But in recent years, some of the recortadores, do I pronounce that word right? Recortadores, bull leapers in Spain and Portugal, trace the tradition of their sport, which is a death-defying one, all the way back to the Minoan civilization. Evans called this fresco of an Alumni woman La Parisienne, after the attractive young women he had met in Paris. He was something of a playboy in his early life. Another well-known artifact is this statuette of the snake goddess, bare-breasted with hoop skirt. And you can see this and a number of other elements that were found in the palace in the Archaeological Museum in the capital city. One of the most beautiful islands in the Aegean, and there are many of them, is the island of Rhodes off the south coast of what is today Turkey. It has been called, appropriately, the Island of the Sun. After an unsuccessful attempt by a Hellenistic king to take the city of Rhodes in 305 BC, the Greeks left, and the enemy's siege equipment was melted down to create a 125-foot bronze statue of the sun god Helios. It provided the model for large bronze sculptures in ancient and modern times. This is an imaginative reconstruction. We're not sure what it looked like. But we don't know where it stood. One possible site for this gigantic sculpture was the entrance to the old harbor with one leg straddling each side, but it's all a guess. The island of Rhodes was conquered by Italy in 1912 after centuries of being a part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. The city architecture was restored under Mussolini in an Art Deco style after World War I in, I think, a very beautiful but somewhat gaudy manner. It's another of those cities in which to walk, and you can visit the impressive Palace of the Grand Masters of the Knights of Rhodes, the bottom of the screen, who, after they were forced to leave Palestine, made the island their headquarters in the Middle Ages. We now proceed to Turkey, to the city of Bodrum, which was originally the Greek colony of Halicarnassus. When Mausolus, the ruler of Halicarnassus, died, his wife Artemisia, who was also his sister, built a gigantic funerary monument that came to be called the Mausoleum, after her husband Mausolus. The original mausoleum was about 148 feet in height. Must have been a very impressive building. The four sides were adorned with sculptural reliefs. The greatest disaster for the large buildings and temples of the Greek world were earthquakes. Greek earthquakes leveled whole buildings, at least one a century for several centuries, and sometimes more than that. The mausoleum was destroyed by successive earthquakes from the 12th through the 15th century, and it was the last surviving of the 6 wonders of the world which were destroyed. Only one of them still is preserved without having collapsed. The word mausoleum is now used, as you know, generically for any above ground tomb. Notice, by the way, before we leave that, the quadriga, the chariot on top with, and in the next slide, the figures seated in a chariot of Mausolus and Artemisia. You won't see these on the spot because they were hauled off to to London, and there they can be seen in the British Museum, although the last time I was in the BM, they were not publicly on display, so they may be by now. But they were gigantic statues, and they can now be seen in the British Museum. Unfortunately, nothing remains today of that once impressive document. If you can go out and see it, you can do as I did last time I was there, hire a taxi to see it, but they're nothing except a few column drums. Why was that? Well, part of it was that the materials were plundered for nearby building projects. That was a commonly practiced idea in the ancient world. Why should you take all new minerals out the hard way when you can tear apart and use the building materials for something else? So there's nothing left of the mausoleum today, except you can see some of the cases of pieces from it that were built into the walls of the castle at Bodrum. The next city on our short tour is Ephesus. It was founded on the coast of Turkey, which the Greeks called Ionia. There were about a dozen Greek cities that were founded by mainland cities in the period following the destruction of the Mycenaean Bronze Age Greek cities, and that colonization occurred between about 1200 and about 1000 BC. Many colonies were founded in Ionia, and most of them were on the coast, but not all. You can see them connected here by the line of the ship's route, but they all became wealthy from their trade, both overland trade across Asia Minor and maritime trade as well. The most impressive of the Ionian cities of Ephesus today, and it's unparalleled as a Greek and Roman archaeological site in Turkey, Western Turkey at any rate, is the Library of Chalcis. It was dedicated by the Roman governor of the city in the early 2nd century AD when he was about ready to leave the city. When I was there in 1968, I was so fascinated by the city, but there wasn't much of this that was preserved. In fact, teams were working, as I was there over several days, putting up what became this beautiful building. And you can enter it today, you can go see it. There's nothing but the facade, but there are statues, you can see them in the porticos, of very famous Greek philosophers. This is what it looked like. No, I'm sorry, this is what another temple looked like, the Ephesian temple to the goddess Artemis. This is a model. It became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and was probably, at the time it was built, the largest of all the Greek temples. It attracted pilgrims from all over the Greek world and elsewhere, and the visitors often made rich dedications to the temple of Artemis. Kings, princes, wealthy people often did that to seek the favor of the goddess for themselves. Unfortunately, it was plundered in late antiquity, in part to construct buildings in Constantinople. If you go to the underground portico, you can see portions that were taken from this famous temple. And statues of Artemis like this, modeled after the famous statue of the patron goddess in the temple of Artemis, you'll notice that she has many breasts, and that's to denote her fertility. She was probably an ancient Near Eastern goddess, a fertility goddess, and she became Artemis, but the Greeks kept her many breasts. I have one of these on the desk in my office. Here we see Curiti Street in Ephesus, a broad road that leads past the library and around. You can see library at the very end of the road, and around to the theater and to the harbor just beyond. Here you see the theater in the foreground, and you see the road that leads down from it. It originally led all the way to the harbor, but of course the harbor isn't there anymore. It's been silted up. And unfortunately, that's what often happened. The theater was one of the biggest in the ancient world, very famous. It was the scene of a near riot that was organized in the 1st century AD by the silversmiths against the Apostle Paul, the Christian apostle. And it was by people who were opposed to the preaching of Christianity in what was a very pagan city. Very, very interesting description of this is in the book of Acts. By the 7th century AD, the harbor had silted up, which was a great tragedy. Unfortunately, the trees and vegetation of all the hills were taken off for building ships and other things. And the heavy rains simply washed the soil down. It filled up the harbor. And by the 7th century AD, the city simply abandoned its site. All these beautiful buildings were largely abandoned because Ephesus had depended on maritime trade. And since there was no harbor left, it had to be abandoned. Our last stop in this evening's tour is Hisarlik, Turkey. You can see in the northern part of the map. It's the site of the legendary city of Troy. This is Homer, the traditional author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer's Iliad describes the famous story of a 10-year war fought by a confederation of Greek cities against the city of Troy. Helen was the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and considered in Greek mythology the most beautiful woman in the world. The war allegedly was caused by her elopement with Paris. She left Sparta, and they both went to Troy. Paris was the son of King Priam, and that famous elopement caused the 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Nearly all European classical historians had come to hold Homer's account of the war as mythical. It was Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy, romantic boy whose father had read him stories of the Trojan War. And when he was a boy, he went on to become a very wealthy man from his interests in Russia and elsewhere. But when he was 46, he retired and decided he wanted to fulfill his lifelong dream of discovering and excavating the ruins of Troy. Now, that was a controversial view. That Troy even existed, that was an historic city, was not believed by many classical historians. But Schliemann was to prove them wrong. This is a plain of Troy, a scene from the hill where Schliemann believed he had discovered the ancient city. I've been to Troy just on one occasion. It was in the late 60s. I had just finished my graduate work in ancient history, and I wanted to see the sites that I'd read about and written about. So I spent 3 months in the Italian and Greek and Turkish world seeing many of the famous sites. I had visited some of the Greek islands. I'd visited the island of Samos just off the coast of Turkey, took a boat. I was intending to stay for a couple of days, and I saw a couple of cities there, and then I decided that I would go up to see Troy. So I went down to the bus station and took a bus that would take me, I thought, to Troy. It's a beautiful trip along the west coast, the highway of Western Turkey. And unfortunately, the driver could speak no English, but he knew where I wanted to go, which was Truva, Turkish for Troy. And after several hours, he stopped and pointed to the west and said, Truva. So I got off with all my bags, and there was a little grocery store with what looked like a one-room hotel in it, and a sign that said, Truva, 7 kilometers. Well, it was the late afternoon, but I wasn't going to sleep near the highway, so I walked. Took about 2 hours to get on that small road to the site of Troy, and I took a quick tour of the site since it was at sunset, starting to get dark. So I spent about an hour and a half. I was the only one there, except for the man in charge of the small museum and the boy who was selling tickets. So I stopped to decide what I was going to do that night. And I had a Coca-Cola. There were no Cokes in Greece, and I was starved for that wonderful taste of a Coke. So I stood there, and he said, what are you going to do tonight? And I said, well, I don't know. Are there any hotels around? And he said, no, but if you want to give me $1, I will take you into Çanakkale, the town to the north, and I'll find a hotel that you can stay on and a good restaurant for a meal, which I thought I deserved by that time. So he took me to Çanakkale, checked me into a little hotel. I walked to a nice restaurant on the Dardanelles, had a nice fish dinner, walked to my hotel, and made sure I was up and out in the town square at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I got back to Çanakkale and was able to return to Greece. So any tourist to Greece or Turkey finds you have to make by yourself sometimes when you didn't make adequate plans for the future. Anyway, a nice anecdote to report. This is the sketch of the hill of Hisarlik before Schliemann began his excavation. It was just a mound. And that was where archaeologists tended to find cities. They were often built on a hill for defensive purposes. And over the centuries, they had been covered by dust and sand and the like. And this is what Hisarlik looked like. Digging from the top down, as every archaeologist has to do, Schliemann had identified over the next several years 9 successive layers of Troy. And the gully-like ditch that you see there is the result of Schliemann's excavations. He found 9 different layers, you can see them here. This is the wall of the various cities that were rebuilt. Most ancient cities were destroyed, sometimes in enemy action, or for all kinds of reasons. And so rather than go off and found a new city, most ancients rebuilt the city. And so you see in the case of Troy, 9 different levels, and they're given them here. It's hard for the non-expert to separate them, but here's a nice schematic that shows the hill at Hisarlik and the various layers that you find. Schliemann believed that Troy 6 was the city that was involved in the Trojan War. In the 1930s, an American named Carl Blagan, who became a very distinguished archaeologist, decided to excavate Troy again because he knew that Schliemann was not the most scientific of excavators. So he brought a whole team for several summers to northwestern Turkey, and he brought not only archaeologists, but graduate students, and also people who were botanists and paleontologists and the like. And he came to the conclusion that Troy 7A, and this is the wall of Troy 7A, better fit the traditional date of Troy's destruction, about 1200 BC. People still disagree, but it's a wonderful site to visit. Schliemann married a young Greek woman when he was still in Germany from letters that he had gotten or written to the Bishop of Athens. And the woman he married was a young woman named Sophia, ne Angastronomenos, that was her Greek name. She joined Schliemann. They apparently had a very happy relationship, though she was much younger than he was. And she is shown here wearing some of the treasures that they found in the excavations at Troy. You wouldn't see them in Turkey because Schliemann smuggled them out of Turkey. He took them to Athens for a while, but he eventually smuggled them out to Germany. But during the Second World War, Russian troops took them as war booty, and for many years said that they didn't know what had happened to them. And I remember I was attending a conference in Belgium, and we were being shown through the archaeological museum by the head of the museum, and he said, by the way, in case you hadn't known, the Russians just admitted to having the Schliemann treasures after many, many years. And if you want to see them today, you can see them in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. If you, on your next trip to Moscow, see the Pushkin Museum. I think it's a great museum, but you have to ask to see the Trojan treasures. And our last slide shows a modern wooden horse in the plaza before the modern gate to the ancient city of Troy. It's a bit kitschy, but it shows a modern wooden horse in the plaza and models the horse that the Greeks are said to have captured Troy in the Iliad. This concludes our all too brief tour of Greece. I hope it gives you an overview of some of the many sites that you can look forward to visiting on your next cruise. And as the Greeks say, "Sas efcharisto," thank you, and bon voyage.
What a great presentation. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Now, we are going to open it up for any question and answer question sessions. So if you do have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and type in your question that you have. In the meantime, while you're thinking about what to ask, I do have one question for you. Out of all these places that you've visited, which one is your favorite and why?
That's a very hard question to answer because there is so much in Greece that is attractive to the visitor. Santorini is so extraordinarily beautiful, and if you know something about background, it's a wonderful site to visit. But as a Greek historian, I have other sites, Athens perhaps, Ephesus. So there you are. You didn't get the answer you wanted, but I would say if you take a cruise, see if you can find one that allows you to visit Santorini.
To go to all of them. Yes, I will say, I don't think you would be the visitor that will just lay on the beach for 2 weeks.
No, I don't think so. The sun is hot enough already in this summer.
Yeah, very true. So I have a question from Dwight. They were wondering, in your opinion, what is the best day trip out of Istanbul?
Well, you can take a day trip out of Istanbul to Troy. And that's a good one. I think if I were, I had visited Troy before I visited Istanbul, so I didn't take that, but that would be probably the one I would visit. Okay, that's my answer.
Yeah, great. And then we have Becky and Jonathan Jones say hello.
Hello.
So if there's any other questions out there, I don't see anyone typing them in at the moment. Just give it a second. And what is your favorite time of the year to go to that region of the world?
Oh, I think maybe spring or fall. Athens can get pretty hot in the summer, July and August. I've been there in September and October. October is a very nice month to be there. The spring as well. But you can't always choose the time of year to visit.
Yeah, it kind of just depends on when you're available.
Yeah, the important thing is to stay out of the hot sun and always wear a hat.
Yes. We have another question from Dwight, was wondering, what is the best day trip out of Athens?
The best day trip? Well, you can go to see the famous site of the Battle of Marathon, which I've been very interested in. Maybe you want to go to see a nearby city like Corinth. You can take trips that will cover maybe a couple of cities in the northern Peloponnese. What shall I say?
Sounds good.
Other cities nearby.
Great. We have a comment that says that was absolutely marvelous, and they're very intrigued to go and love to visit and see the sites. And Tim was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the 100-year anniversary of the Turks kicking the Greeks out of Western Turkey.
Well, I have to tread carefully there because there are two peoples involved. When I said that, when I said that the Greeks colonized Ionia, that is the west coast of Asia Minor, that was about 1200 to 1000 BC, and they stayed there. And their cities, Ephesus and Halicarnassus, and many of those became very wealthy cities. Some of the wealthiest in Greece because the goods were shipped across Asia Minor and then put on boats, and so they made lots of money. They stayed there, believe it or not, until the early 1920s. If you went to towns like Ephesus, they were virtually Greek cities. And when the Ottoman Empire was overthrown and the Sultan of Turkey was sent on his way, there was a revolution under Ataturk. And Ataturk wanted to unify Turkey, which had been one of the losers in World War I. And so he began to expel foreigners, including the Greeks from the Ionian coast. And that was a disaster for the Greeks. These beautiful cities in which the Greeks had lived for 3,000 years were largely rid of Greeks. And you can still see a few of them there today, but not many. There were, over 1 million, maybe 2 million, I've forgotten, who went first to Thrace, northern Greece, and scattered all throughout Greece. A very difficult time for the Greeks, but that's part of the changing world.
Yes, that's very true. Becky was wondering if you could only go to one area, since you're very familiar with both the Greco-Roman and the Egyptian ancient history. If you could only choose one region, which one would you recommend?
Now, you're talking about both one region in each country or one region in one country?
My guess would be one region in one country.
Okay. Well, I've been to Egypt 7 times, and you can't see everything even in 7 times. It's an extraordinary country. I think the most interesting of all the ancient countries. But Greece is my first love. I'm a Greek historian. And there are so many things to see in Egypt. One thing, in Greece, one thing I would recommend is that you take a week-long tour of Greece if you have time to do that. You usually are picked up by a bus at your motel in the morning on Monday at 8 o'clock, and you travel throughout the Peloponnese, see the best of all the ancient sites, and then you're deposited back at your hotel on Friday afternoon. Time for a nice dinner. So that's, if you have a short time, that would be the nice way to do it. Or you can always rent a taxi. Go to someone in your hotel and ask to recommend a reliable taxi and ask suggestions.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to travel on your own right through that area.
It is, right.
Yeah. So another question is, can Greece and Turkey hope to reclaim and recover their treasures that have been transported to other countries and museums?
The short answer is no.
No.
And I'm not taking sides in that. I've read quite a bit on both sides. Of course, the Elgin marbles are the first things that come to mind. The Greeks have for years throughout the 20th century demanded that the British return them. And of course, the British don't want to, because they argue, and I just read something this afternoon by one of the people who was a cabinet minister in London when they were debating the issues. Lord Elgin saved the marbles. They had been lying since the 1660s, just on the ground in the elements, and at tremendous cost to himself. He saved them and shipped them back to London. Did he have the right to do that? No, we would say today. But on the other hand, if they had been left there, they'd be in much worse condition than they are today. So the museums abroad generally are reluctant to return their treasures. And of course, the people that had them originally think they belong to them. It's an unwinnable argument. And yeah. I won't even come down on one side, except to say that many of those treasures that were brought to Europe were saved on that account. Now, maybe they should in the end go back, but they wouldn't have been saved probably if they can continue to lie on the ground.
Right.
A long answer to a short question.
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. I mean, I've seen it all over the world. When something is left, it gets repurposed, it gets moved, it gets taken. It's
taken home for souvenirs often.
Yep.
And when I went to Egypt the first couple of times, you could pick up a stone that had fallen off, say the step pyramid, and take home to put on your desk. Now they've rebuilt that, and they have very careful ways to preserve that, and that's all. The Egyptians have done a wonderful job in preserving their antiquities. And if you go to Egypt on an OSU trip, I think by November of this year, the new archaeological museum.
Well, we were hoping.
Well,
actually.
I hope so. I've got a trip planned to Egypt, and I hope it will be finished. And you can also see the Coptic Cathedral, the new one, which was built. So
yeah, unfortunately, the new Grand Museum is not open. We just had a group return from Egypt, and the word on the street is maybe in 2023. They keep pushing the dates back, and they're just not finished with it yet. There's a lot that has been moved over, but it's just not ready to open.
No.
So,
well, that's a long story. James Henry Breasted, one of the greatest Egyptian archaeologists, an American, had money from Rockefeller to build a new museum in the 1920s. And because of political difficulties, it was never built. So anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing that. My trip is planned for 2023. So maybe it will be finished by then.
Yeah, maybe the latter part of 2023.
Right.
We've been saying that museum is going to open for two and a half years now, and it's just still there is a website that you can go to if you're anxious about it. You can go to online and search the Grand Egyptian Museum. It's an independently run website, but you can be added to a list where they'll notify you when it actually is open. They used to have.
Yes, there's so much to see in Egypt. It takes several trips to see even the minimal things.
Yes. And we had one last question, and I can add to this one too.
Okay.
Elizabeth was wondering if you consider it safe to travel to Istanbul right now.
I would say yes. I don't think a woman should travel by herself generally in that part of the world. And I would say the same thing about Egypt. I think a good travel companion is always worth having. Yes, it's safe. I've been there many times. There isn't one terrorist group. I can't remember what they call it. It's the Kurds, and they bombed something just recently. But then we have that sort of thing in our own country now. We can't throw stones anymore. Yes, I would say it's always better to have a traveling companion and stay in a good hotel.
Yeah, I agree. We do. We have trips. And a lot of our partnering schools have tours that go off to that region right now, and they're having wonderful times. And a group travel is a great way to go, especially.
It is a great way.
Yeah, especially if you're not quite familiar or comfortable going on your own.
Well, I hate to say which is my favorite, but Istanbul is one of my favorite cities in the whole world, because you see the Greeks who settled it originally, and then the Romans conquered it, and then the Byzantine Empire conquered, and the Ottomans came last. So you can walk through areas of the old city and see half a dozen different world civilizations almost on top of each other.
It's on my list for sure. Definitely. One of these days, get over to that area.
Okay.
Well, gosh, this is great. We are, I want to preview a couple trips that actually we're going to head out here in 2023 into that region. And the first one, these are going to be short, is Picturesque Mediterranean. I will say that one is completely waitlisted right now, but you never know with COVID. I didn't think people want to get on cruise ships, but they are the fastest selling tours that we have. People still want to jump on those ships. So if you're thinking about cruising, I wouldn't wait. This one is waitlisted, but if it is of interest, let me know. People still are canceling and others are joining. Another cruise is the Greek Isles Odyssey. This is also with Go Next and Oceania Cruise Lines. It's on their brand new ship, the Vista. Its inaugural season is 2023. There's 1,200 guests on the tour. So it's a mix from all different schools that are on this trip. You can see where it heads out in that region. So it is something to check out. The price is $5,399 per person for a French veranda. French veranda is a room that has a window that comes down halfway. So you get a big, huge window opening instead of a traditional balcony, but there are rooms with balconies too. So those are the two cruises, and then we have two land trips. One is to Greece. You're staying in two areas, so you'll have 3 nights in Athens, 5 nights in Githeo, and then you're going to visit different cities while you're there. So you'll have 2 anchor points. There's a maximum of 24 travelers on this tour, and it is with Oregon State as well as other schools. So it's a mix of different schools on this trip, but it's a great way to see the highlights of the area. And then the last one is Legendary Turkey. So this tour is with Odysseys Unlimited. I have here only 12 OSU travelers because we are partnering with USC on this trip. So the two institutions, USC and Oregon State, will be on this trip together. So they have 12 spots and we have 12 spots for a total of 24 travelers. Now, if we end up where USC doesn't quite fill their spots, then we do have the ability to fill what's left over. This is a great trip to see the highlights of Turkey, the ancient ruins, the dramatic turquoise coast. This trip, the price does include air from Portland at $4,692 per person. That is including airfare from Portland. So you can view all of these tours and many more on our website. The website is fororegonstate.org/travel. There's a link to our tour calendar, as well as links to our travel talks presentations. This is where this talk will live. After tonight, you'll find it there, as well as some of the others that we have done over the past few months. And if you want to contact us to talk about travel options, here is our information. You can reach us in a variety of email addresses, phone numbers. You can text, message if that's easy as well. And of course, find us online. And if you are on Facebook, so are we. We like to continue that conversation on social media. So this is where you can find us, facebook.com/group/OSUAA travel, for OSU Alumni Association travel. So join the conversation online if you wish. I'm about to post some really great photos from my tour back. Just got back from Egypt. So look for those. And lastly, Gary, thank you very much for joining us tonight. That was a really great conversation, great overview of all these wonderful sites, and so educational, and I really appreciate it.
Kate. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening and good night all.
Good night.